2,000 years of monarchy, 268 years of the Manchu Dynasty, all collapsed not by an army but by a signature. And here is the greatest tragedy. The hand holding the pen was not the hand of a revolutionary, a tyrant, or a warrior. It was the hand of the weakest, loneliest, and most insignificant woman in China. She was the Empress Dowager Longyu, a woman with no ambition, no talent, no strategy. She was just a hostage forced by history to become a gravedigger for an empire. For thousands of years, China had seen itself as the celestial empire, the center of the universe, the place where all civilization emanated. But by the 1800s, that illusion of glory was shattered by the ironclad fleets and cannons of the West. The opium wars of the mid-century brutally opened China's doors. Opium, smuggled by British merchants, devastated society, turning millions into drug-addicted ghosts. The Manchu army, which had conquered an entire continent, was now powerless against better organized, better armed foreign armies. The result was humiliation, the unequal treaties. Hong Kong was ceded to Britain. Major port cities like Shanghai and Tianjin were turned into concessions, where Westerners lived by their own rules, with signs reading, "No dogs and no Chinese." Gold and silver flowed out of the country like a bleeding wound internally. The situation was even worse. The Qing dynasty, a dynasty of Manchu conquerors, had long since lost its morale. Corruption had become a cancer, spreading from the lowest levels of the bureaucracy all the way up to the Forbidden City funds, meant to modernize the Navy, were instead embezzled to build a lavish marble ship in the Summer Palace for one person, Empress Dowager Cixi. And while the court was consumed with intrigue and decadence, people were dying. The Taiping Rebellion, one of the bloodiest civil wars in human history, claimed at least 20 million lives. Though suppressed, it left an incurable scar, revealing the utter inability of the imperial court to control its own country. This was the world into which Longyu was born, a world of humiliation, corruption, and pervasive incompetence. In the Forbidden City, a war was being waged without gunfire. On one side was the reformist faction, a small group of radical intellectuals and officials who realized that China had to change, had to learn from the West or else perish. Representing them, ironically, was the young Guangxu emperor. On the other side was the conservative faction, a giant granite monolith composed of Manchu nobles, powerful eunuchs, and those who believed that any change was a betrayal of the ancestors. And atop that monolith, reigning absolute, was the Empress Dowager Cixi. Cixi was one of the most powerful women in history. From a low-ranking concubine, she rose to the pinnacle of power through cunning, ruthlessness, and an iron will. She ruled China from behind the curtain for nearly half a century. She did not believe in reform. She believed only in power. And Longyu, her real name was Jingfen. She was born in 1868 into the Aluti clan, one of the most prestigious Manchu clans. And most importantly, she was the biological niece of Empress Dowager Cixi. Her fate was decided not by talent or beauty, but by that blood connection. In 1889, she was brought into the palace. She was not chosen for her beauty, her intelligence, or anything related to herself. She was appointed by Cixi to be the empress of her nephew, Emperor Guangxu. The purpose of this marriage was not love, nor was it to perpetuate the family line. It was a political move. Cixi needed a watchdog, a loyal pair of eyes and ears, right next to the young emperor, who was becoming increasingly rebellious and who could be more loyal than her own niece. For Jingfen, then 21, it was the highest honor. For Guangxu, then 18, it was the beginning of a tragedy. The marriage of Jingfen and Emperor Guangxu was a disaster from the start. It was considered one of the most expensive weddings in Qing history. Millions of taels of silver were spent on lavish ceremonies and lavish wedding gifts, while outside the Forbidden City, the country was in ruins. In a chilling omen for the future of the dynasty, on the eve of the wedding, a mysterious fire burned down the Taihemen, the main gate to the Forbidden City. The grand ceremonies had to be conducted through a makeshift passageway. It seemed as if heaven and earth were opposed to this forced marriage. Guangxu was a smart, sensitive, and somewhat vulnerable young man. He grew up in the shadow of Cixi, whom he both feared and hated. He yearned to seize real power to save his country. He read about Peter the Great's reforms in Russia, about the Meiji Restoration in Japan. He believed that China could be saved. And then he was forced to marry Longyu. Longyu was everything Guangxu hated. She was not an ugly woman, as many malicious rumors later claimed, but she was certainly not a beauty. She was tall, slightly thin, with a slightly hunched back and a long, sad face. More importantly, she was the embodiment of everything a traditional Manchu woman brought up to believe in absolute obedience, in elaborate rituals, and above all, in the authority of the Empress Dowager Cixi. She was incapable of sharing Guangxu's dreams of a modern China. She probably did not even understand them. For Guangxu, whenever he saw Longyu, he did not see a wife. He saw a supervisor. He saw a jailer. He saw the very embodiment of the mother who had restrained him all his life. Love, if there was one, never had a chance to blossom. Historical records and oral traditions both show that Guangxu shunned Longyu from their wedding night. He refused to touch her. He spent his time reading, meeting reform-minded teachers, and seeking solace elsewhere. There he found it in Consort Jen. If Longyu was a symbol of the conservative past, then Consort Jen was the embodiment of the bright future. Consort Jen was beautiful, intelligent, lively, and daring. She not only shared Guangxu's love, she also shared his ideals. She supported his learning of English. She wore Western clothes. She was even curious about photography. She was Guangxu's confidant, his only political ally in the palace. Guangxu's marriage now turned into a classic three-way tragedy, but with deadly political calculations. Longyu, as the empress, was the head of the harem, but she had absolutely no power. She was isolated. Guangxu's estrangement was a public humiliation. His love for Consort Jen was a daily slap in the face. What could she do? She could only do the only thing she had been taught to do. Run to her guardian. Empress Dowager Cixi Longyu became Cixi's eyes and ears, not because she was cruel, but perhaps because she was so weak and lonely. She reported every move of Guangxu and Consort Jen to the Empress Dowager. Every conversation about reform, every Western book read, every odd action by imperial concubine Jen, all reached Cixi. Longyu did it in exchange for protection, recognition, or perhaps just a little attention from the only powerful woman in her life. She chose sides, and that choice sealed her fate and the fate of those around her. In 1898, the tragedy came to a head. Encouraged by imperial concubine Jen and reformers like Kang Yue and Liang Qichao, Guangxu decided to act. He launched the 100 Days of Reform. For 103 days, he issued a series of edicts to modernize China from the ground up, reforming education, the military, the economy, and even the bureaucracy. It was a desperate gamble. He was trying to save the country and also trying to wrest power from Cixi. But how could he win against a political fox who had ruled for 40 years? Cixi, who was in the summer palace at the time, watched her nephew's every move with cold contempt. She was just waiting for the right moment. And when Guangxu, in a desperate move, tried to seize control of the army, she took action. She launched a coup. The 100 Days of Reform collapsed. Leading reformers were executed. Kang Yue and Liang Qichao fled abroad. And the Guangxu emperor, he was imprisoned. He was imprisoned on Yingtai, a small, beautiful, but isolated island within the Forbidden City. He became a prisoner king. What was Longyu's role in this coup? She was not the mastermind, but she was a tool. She was the one who watched and reported Guangxu's rebellious actions to Cixi. She had helped bring about her own husband's downfall, perhaps without fully realizing the consequences. And what happened to Consort Zhen? Cixi never forgave her. She blamed Consort Zhen for corrupting the emperor. Consort Zhen was stripped of all her titles, publicly flogged, and imprisoned in a cold palace. 2 years later, in 1900, when the Eight-Nation Alliance attacked Beijing to put down the Boxer Rebellion, an anti-foreigner uprising that Cixi herself had secretly supported, the entire court had to flee the Forbidden City. In the midst of the chaos, before leaving, Cixi gave one final order. She summoned Consort Zhen, and according to historical records, she ordered the eunuchs to throw Consort Zhen, then 24, down a well in the palace Longyu's rival was gone, brutally murdered. Longyu was now the only woman beside Guangxu. She was the only empress. But her victory was a hollow one. She had won by losing everything. She had gained a husband, but he was a lifeless corpse, a captive king who now hated her more than ever. In the fall of 1908, the atmosphere in the Forbidden City was heavy. The Empress Dowager Cixi had fallen gravely ill. The empire held its breath. Everyone knew the old Buddha was about to pass away. And the biggest question hung in the air: what would happen next? The Guangxu emperor, though imprisoned, was still the rightful heir. Once Cixi died, he would, in theory, be free. He would reclaim the throne. And what would be the first thing he would do? He would continue the unfinished reforms, and he would have his revenge. He would punish all those who had betrayed him, imprisoned him, and killed the woman he loved. Cixi, even on her deathbed, understood this clearly. She could not let him survive her. Her history, her legacy, and the safety of her entire family depended on Guangxu dying first. On November 13th, 1908, the Guangxu emperor, who had been ailing for years, suddenly became seriously ill, very ill, severe abdominal pain, convulsions, and paralysis. He died on November 14th at the age of 37. His death was too timely, too suspicious. For decades, it was one of the greatest mysteries of Chinese history. It was a conspiracy. But who did it? Historians argue, was it Cixi whose motives were clearest? Or was it Yuan Shikai, the general who betrayed him during the 1898 reforms and now feared his revenge? That mystery was only solved 100 years later. In 2008, Chinese forensic scientists, in a stunning investigation, examined the remains of Emperor Guangxu. They took samples of his hair, ribs, and clothing. The result, they found a huge amount of arsenic. The amount was 2,400 times higher than normal. It was not a natural death. It was an assassination. The Guangxu emperor was systematically poisoned, and the poison was given to him just days before Cixi took her last breath. The order could only have come from one person. On her deathbed, Cixi made sure that her hated nephew would never see the light of day. The news of the emperor's death was brought to Longyu. What was her reaction? History does not record. Did she mourn for the husband who never loved her? Or did she tremble with fear? She had just lost her husband, but more importantly, she was about to lose her only patron. Just 22 hours after Guangxu's death, On November 15th, 1908, Empress Dowager Cixi, China's uncrowned queen who had ruled the country for 47 years, passed away. In an instant, the giant dragon was dead. The throne was empty. The power that Cixi had held so tightly to her was now in the air. And in her final moments, Cixi made a series of final decisions. These decisions, designed to maintain her family's power, ended up being the final nail in the coffin of the Qing dynasty. She bypassed all adults who were capable of ruling. Instead, she appointed a 2-year-old child as the next emperor. That was Puyi, Guangxu's nephew. Next, she appointed Puyi's father, Zaifeng, as prince regent to rule in his son's stead. And finally, she issued an edict elevating the status of her obscure granddaughter, Empress Jingfen, Guangxu's widow, would be elevated to the position of Empress Dowager with the title Longyu. This was not a gift, it was a trap. By making Longyu Empress Dowager, Cixi created a dual power structure. There would be a prince regent and an empress dowager. Longyu, as the nominal mother of Emperor Puyi, would have the highest ceremonial power. All decrees had to bear the seals of both. Cixi did not do this because she trusted Longyu's talent. She did it precisely because she knew Longyu had no talent. She knew Longyu was weak, docile, and completely loyal to the Yehenara clan. Longyu would be a watchdog, a brake. To ensure that Prince Regent Zaifeng did not stray, Cixi gave Longyu the cup filled with poison. She'd turned her obscure niece into the last symbol of a dying dynasty. Longyu is now 40 years old. In her entire life, she has never had to make an important decision. She lives by obeying orders, and now she is the Empress Dowager of China. The first scene of her new dynasty is a tragic farce. Puyi's coronation. The 2-year-old child is forced to wear a heavy imperial robe sitting on the giant dragon throne in the Palace of Supreme Harmony. The child is frightened, cries loudly, and wants to go home. His father, Prince Regent Zaifeng, tries to comfort him. Don't cry, it's almost over." But the child still cries. Tired and frustrated, Zaifeng says a sentence that later became considered a creepy prophecy. It's almost over. It means it's almost over, but it also means it's almost over. Longyu stood there in her resplendent Empress Dowager attire, witnessing this scene. She was not the one in charge. She was just a symbol. The real power lay in the hands of Prince Regent Zaifeng, and Zaifeng, like Longyu, was completely unsuited for the job. He was a gentle, indecisive man, and the only thing he had was a deep, personal vendetta. He hated Yuan Shikai, the general who had betrayed his brother, Emperor Guangxu, during the 1898 reforms. And this was the forbidden city that Longyu had just inherited. It was not a government. It was a nest of snakes. Imagine her chessboard. In one corner, Prince Regent Zaifeng and a group of young Manchu nobles. They were old, arrogant, and called the Iron Hats. They hated the Han, hated reform, and believed they could rule by force. Their top priority, kill Yuan Shikai to avenge Guangxu. On the other side, there was Yuan Shikai. Yuan was not a Manchu noble. He was a Han, but he controlled the only army capable of fighting in China, the Beiyang army. He was cunning, ambitious, and ruthless. He knew the imperial court needed him, and outside the revolutionaries, led by Sun Yat-sen, were calling for a complete overthrow. Along with them were the moderate constitutionalists who were demanding a real parliament. Longyu was caught in the middle. She was the only one, by protocol, to have the final say. Her seal was needed. Her first test came immediately. Zaifeng and the Manchu princes wanted Yuan Shikai executed. A heated argument broke out in the palace. killing Yuan Shikai would be suicide, his Beiyang army would revolt immediately. And Longyu, the weak woman, made the first real decision of her life. It was not a heroic decision, but a very pragmatic one. She chose a middle path. She saved Yuan Shikai's life. Instead of being executed, Yuan Shikai was removed from all his positions. The official reason given? He had a foot disease and needed to go home to recuperate. It was a clumsy lie that saved face for both sides. Yuan Shikai knew this was an ultimatum. He bowed and returned to his hometown in Henan, but he still held the loyalty of every commander in the Beiyang army. He was just waiting. Longyu had avoided an immediate civil war. It was a small victory, an act of survival. It showed perhaps that she was not entirely naive. She was a survivor. She did not fight. She compromised. After Yuan Shikai left, the imperial court, under Zaifeng and with Longyu's approval, continued the reforms that Cixi had promised. They really had no choice. In 1909, provincial assemblies were elected. In 1910, a provisional national assembly, the first in Chinese history, was convened in Beijing. Students were sent abroad. Plans for a full constitution were drawn up. On the surface, this was Longyu's brief peak. She was presiding over a historic transition from an autocratic empire to a constitutional monarchy, like those in Britain or Japan. She was doing what her husband had died trying to do, but it was all an illusion. The essence of the Qing court had not changed. The Manchu nobles around Longyu and Zaifeng did not really believe in sharing power. They were just stalling for time. And in May 1911, they made a fatal mistake. After years of delay, the court finally announced China's first responsible cabinet. This was supposed to be a moment of national harmony, a cabinet that included both Manchus and Han. But when the list was announced, the whole country was stunned. Of the 13 cabinet members, 8 were Manchu nobles. Of those, 5 were members of the imperial family. It was not a cabinet. It was a joke, a public humiliation. The Manchu ruling class had sent a clear message to the 400 million Han people: we will never give up power. Historically, it was called the Imperial Cabinet. It was the last straw. The moderate reformers, the middle-class Han people, the people who had patiently believed in a peaceful transition, they all realized they had been deceived. The dynasty could not be saved. It had to be destroyed. All the opposing factions, from the most moderate constitutionalists to the most violent revolutionaries, were now united in a common goal. They no longer believed in the promises of Longyu or Zaifeng. The Empress Dowager Longyu, in her attempt to preserve power for her royal family, had unwittingly signed the death warrant for her own dynasty. She had united all her enemies. The empire was now a rotting building, filled with explosives, and all it needed was a spark. That spark came from an unlikely source, not from revolutionaries in Guangzhou, not from intellectuals in Shanghai, but from a dispute over a railway. The imperial court, in a desperate attempt to make money, decided to nationalize the private railways in Sichuan, then sell control to foreign banks. This sparked anger. Local businessmen and people who had invested their money in the railways felt robbed. Protests broke out in Sichuan. The imperial court responded in the only way it knew how: repression. They opened fire on unarmed protesters. To quell the growing rebellion in Sichuan, the Beijing court ordered military units from nearby Hubei province to move in, and that was their final mistake. By moving troops out of Hubei, they left the provincial capital, Wuchang, virtually undefended. And in Wuchang, within the ranks of that same army, were thousands of soldiers who had secretly sworn allegiance to revolutionary organizations. They had been waiting for this moment, and now it had come. When the news first trickled into the Forbidden City in Beijing, it was met with almost complete indifference. Another day, another peasant revolt. This was the sort of thing that happened. Longyu and the regent, Prince Chun, were assured by their ministers that this was a minor disturbance. It would be crushed in a week. They were wrong. What happened next was not a war. It was a contagion. The Wuchang uprising was not a plan. It was a signal. It was the signal that the empire was, in fact, hollow. The mandate of heaven was gone. Within days, other provinces were watching. Then, one by one, they began to fall. October 22nd, Hunan Province declares independence from Beijing. October 23rd, Jiangxi Province. October 29th, Shaanxi. October 30th, Shanxi. November 3rd, Jiangsu. November 4th, Zhejiang. November 9th, Guangdong. The heart of Sun, Yat-sen's revolutionary movement. It was a landslide. In less than 6 weeks, 15 of China's 18 provinces had declared themselves independent of Manchu rule. The Qing dynasty, which had ruled for 268 years, now controlled basically just the city of Beijing and the land immediately surrounding it. The panic in the Forbidden City was no longer theoretical. It was total. The Iron Hat princes, the arrogant Manchu nobles who just months before had been plotting to secure their eternal power, were now screaming at each other in terror. They had no army. The troops they did have were part of the same new army system that was now rebelling. They couldn't trust a single soldier. The regent, Prince Chun, was a broken man. He was weak-willed in the best of times. Now he was utterly paralyzed by fear. And Longyu, the Empress Dowager, the woman who was, by tradition, the sacred binding force of the dynasty, she was, as she had been her entire life, a terrified ghost. She wandered the palaces, weeping, clutching the small 5-year-old Emperor Puyi to her. She had no political solution. She had no military plan. She only had her terror. She was surrounded by enemies, trapped in a palace that was about to become her tomb. The court was bankrupt. The royal cabinet had resigned in disgrace. The government had ceased to exist. And in this moment of total abject desperation, every single person in that palace, the hardline princes, the terrified eunuchs, the weeping Longyu, and the spineless Prince Chun, all came to the same horrifying conclusion. There was only one man in all of China who could save them. One man who had the loyalty of an army. One man who was cunning enough to negotiate and ruthless enough to fight. The very same man they had ruthlessly humiliated and exiled 3 years earlier. The man Prince Chun had sworn a personal oath to kill. They had to bring back Yuan Shikai. Yuan Shikai had been waiting for this moment. When the court had dismissed him in 1908, sending him home in disgrace for his leg ailment, he didn't retire. He waited. From his vast fortified estate in Henan province, he had maintained a spider's web of contacts with every commander in the Beiyang army, the army he had personally created, trained, and promoted. These were his men. They were loyal to him, not to the child emperor in Beijing. Now the desperate telegrams arrived from the capital. Please save the dynasty. Come back. All is forgiven. And Yuan Shikai, in a master stroke of political theater, said no. He replied politely that, alas, his leg ailment had returned. He was very sorry. He was an old sick man. He couldn't possibly travel. The court panicked. They sent more messengers. They offered him governorships. He refused. They offered him command of the army. He refused. He wasn't just holding out for a better offer. He was waiting for them to offer him everything. Finally, as the revolutionaries grew bolder and the court grew more desperate, they gave in. Yuan Shikai laid out his terms. It was not a negotiation. It was a list of demands, and He would be given supreme, unquestionable command of all military and naval forces. 2. He would be given the new, all-powerful post of Prime Minister with a new cabinet chosen by him. 3. The hated royal cabinet would be formally abolished. 4. He must be given a full and immediate pardon for all past actions. 5. He must be given a massive budget with no questions asked. 6. And most importantly, the hardline Iron Hat princes were to be barred from government. It was total, unconditional surrender. The Manchu court was being asked to hand over the entire empire to the one man they feared and hated most, Longyu. And Prince Chun had no choice. It was this, or it was the Revolutionary Army. They agreed. On October 30th, 1911, Yuan Shikai's leg ailment miraculously healed. He accepted his new posts. He was now, in effect, the military dictator of China. The fox had just been handed the keys to the henhouse, and then he did something brilliant. He proved he was worth the price. He ordered his loyal Beiyang army into action. And unlike the disorganized rabble the court had been using, his troops were professional, modern, and ruthless within days. They had stormed the revolutionary-held city of Hankou, reducing it to ashes and routing the rebel forces. It was a stunning, brutal display of power. It sent a double message. To the revolutionaries in the South, the message was, I am not the weak Manchu court. I am Yuan Shikai. I can and I will crush you. And to the court in Beijing, the message was, you see, I am the only one who can save you. You need me more than I need you. He had them. He had both sides exactly where he wanted them. He had his boot on the throat of the revolution and his hand around the wallet of the court. And then he stopped fighting. Just as he was on the verge of crushing the Wuchang rebels completely, Yuan Shikai ordered his armies to halt. He arranged a ceasefire. Why? Because Yuan Shikai was not interested in winning the war. He was interested in profiting from it. A quick victory for the court would mean he was no longer needed. A quick victory for the rebels would mean he was out of a job. No, the real prize was not on the battlefield. It was at the negotiating table he sat down in the middle. He was now the arbiter of China's destiny, and he began in secret to play the most dangerous double game in modern history. To the south, to the revolutionaries, who had now formed a provisional government in Nanjing with Sun Yat-sen as their president, Yuan sent his envoys. His message was practical, cynical, and brilliant. Look, he essentially said, we can fight this to the last man. It will be a bloody, terrible war that will tear China apart. And in the end, I will probably win. Or we can make a deal. You want a republic? Fine. You can have your republic. You want the emperor gone? I am the only man who can make that happen. I can get him to abdicate peacefully. No civil war, no bloodshed. All I ask for in return is a simple, practical thing. You, Dr. Sun, are a philosopher. I am a soldier. A new republic needs a strong man to guide it. Let me get the abdication, and you make me the first president. Sun Yat-sen was horrified, but he was also a realist. His new government had no money and no army that could match Yuan's Beiyang troops. He knew Yuan was right. Simultaneously, Yuan Shikai went to the north, to the Forbidden City. He went to the terrified Empress Dowager Longyu, and he delivered a message of pure psychological terror. Imagine you are Longyu. It is the deep winter of 1911. You are 43 years old, a widow, and the legal guardian of a 6-year-old boy who happens to be the emperor of China. You are, for the first time in your life, the most powerful person in the room, and you are more terrified than you have ever been. The hardline Iron Hat princes are storming through the palace halls. They are screaming for war. They are proud Manchu warriors. They shout at you, calling you a coward. They would rather die, they say, rather burn the entire city to the ground than surrender to Han traitors. They are demanding a fight to the glorious bitter end. Then your prime minister, Yuan Shikai, comes to you. He is polite, he is respectful, but his eyes are cold, and he paints you a picture. He tells you that the army is no longer loyal. He tells you that the treasury is empty. He tells you that the foreign powers, the British, the French, the Americans, have all made it clear that they will not intervene to save you. And then he tells you about history. He tells you about the French Revolution. He describes in calm, measured tones what happens to a royal family when the people turn against them. He talks about Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. He talks about the guillotine. He makes it clear if you fight, you will lose. And when you lose, it will not be a negotiation. The revolutionaries will show no mercy. They will storm this palace. They will hunt down every Manchu they can find. They will drag you and the 6-year-old boy you are sworn to protect into the street. They will tear you limb from limb. The Iron Hats were offering you a glorious death. Yuan Shikai was offering you a deal. He had been negotiating with the South. He had a document. He called it the Articles of Favorable Treatment. It wasn't a surrender. It was a contract. The revolutionaries, he said, were prepared to be generous. If you abdicated, now the Emperor Puyi would not be harmed. He would even be allowed to keep his title, Emperor, for the rest of his life. He would be allowed to stay right here in the Forbidden City. The family tombs would be protected. All Manchu people would be given full rights as citizens of the new republic. And, most importantly, the imperial family would be given a massive annual stipend from the new government. 4 million taels of silver Yuan Shikai had presented Longyu with the ultimate cynical choice. The princes offered her a fantasy of glory, which she knew meant certain death. Yuan offered her a favorable humiliation, which guaranteed survival. What would you choose? What would any mother facing the prospect of her child's violent death choose? Longyu was not a warrior. She was not a queen. She was, at her very core, a survivor. She had survived a loveless marriage, the schemes of Shikshi, and the murder of her rival. Her entire life had been an exercise in enduring humiliation in order to live another day. She knew what she had to do. The court exploded. The Iron Hat princes were apoplectic. They screamed. They wept. They accused her of being the greatest traitor in Manchu history. One of them, Prince Gong, literally spat blood in a fit of rage and had to be carried from the room. They boycotted the final meetings. They refused to be part of it, which was exactly what Yuan Shikai wanted. In the end, it came down to a scene of profound, tragic intimacy. It was February 12th, 1912, a cold, bleak Beijing morning. In a quiet hall in the palace, there were no ministers. There were no princes. There was just Yuan Shikai, the master manipulator, the 6-year-old Emperor Puyi, who was probably bored and playing with his toys, and the 44-year-old Empress Dowager Longyu Yuan presented the final document, the Abdication Edict. Puyi, in his autobiography, recalled the moment. He said Longyu was sitting on a sofa, weeping uncontrollably. He, a small child, had no idea what was happening. He only knew that this big, fat man, Yuan Shikai, was making his mother cry. She cried for her lost husband, Guangxu. She cried for her aunt, Shikshi. She cried for the empire, for her ancestors. She cried for her own empty, wasted life. And then she did it. She took the great imperial seal, the very symbol of 4,000 years of power, and she pressed it onto the document. In a single, quiet, bureaucratic act, the empire was over. The edict itself, drafted by Yuan's men, is a masterpiece of political face-saving. It does not say, "we surrender." It says, "we grant." It reads, The will of providence is clear, and the hearts of the people are aligned, we the emperor, do hereby grant the sovereignty of the Chinese people to them to form a great republic. We do this not for our own glory, but for the welfare of the people, and to avoid the horror of civil war. It was perhaps the noblest lie ever told in a political document. With that stamp, Longyu performed the greatest and last act of her reign. It was not an act of strength, but an act of profound, pragmatic, and heartbreaking weakness. She was not a hero. She was not a villain. She was a realtor. She had just negotiated the peaceful sale of the largest, oldest political entity on earth. There was no guillotine in the public square. There was no firing squad in a basement. Just a weeping woman, a playing child, and a quiet man signing a contract the revolution was over. Yuan Shikai was the new president. Sun Yat-sen had his republic, at least in name. And Longyu, she was now just a widow. A dowager with no empire to be dowager of. Her great historical role was finished. All that was left was to die. But what happens the day after you surrender an empire? This is where the story enters one of the strangest, most surreal chapters in all of modern history. Yuan Shikai, in his cynical genius, had not just demanded an abdication, he had signed a contract. It was called the Articles of Favorable Treatment for the Great Qing Emperor after his abdication. And this contract created a pocket universe, a bizarre bubble of make-believe right in the heart of the new republic. The contract stated, 1, the emperor's title would not be abolished. He would be Emperor Xuantong for the rest of his life, treated by the new republic with the courtesy due to a foreign monarch's too. He would be allowed to live in the northern half of the Forbidden City. The new government would take the grand public halls, but the private palaces, the gardens, the temples, would remain his 3. The new republic would pay the imperial household an annual stipend of 4 million silver taels, an enormous sum, to maintain their lifestyle. 4, he would be allowed to retain his entire court, his eunuchs, his court ladies, his ritual officers, and his imperial guard. In essence, Longyu had not been deposed. She had just become the landlady of a much smaller property. The revolution had stopped at the palace gates. Outside those gates, the 5-striped flag of the Republic flumen were cutting off their Manchu pigtails, wearing Western suits and shouting about democracy. But inside those gates, time froze. Nothing changed. Every morning, Longyu would wake up. Court ladies would dress her in the elaborate embroidered robes of an Empress Dowager. Eunuchs would bow and scrape, addressing her with the high-flown titles of a bygone age. She would preside over empty rituals. She would manage the complex, petty politics of the thousands of eunuchs and concubines who were now trapped with her in this gilded cage. And every day she would preside over the education of Puyi. The 6-year-old boy was still taught that he was the son of heaven. He had tutors who would kowtow to him, prostrating themselves on the ground, before teaching him the ancient Confucian texts that declared him the divine ruler of all under heaven. It was a pantomime, a grand, tragic, and absurd play performed on an empty stage. Imagine the psychological torment. Longyu was now technically a private citizen, but she was also technically still the Empress Dowager. She was the head of a court that had no empire. She was a ghost, haunting her own home, which was now also her prison. And worse, she was not alone. She was trapped with the very people who blamed her for their downfall. The Manchu Iron Hat princes, the hardliners who had demanded she fight to the death, had not all fled. Many of them also lived in the Forbidden City or in their nearby mansions, protected by the new republic. To them, Longyu was not a pragmatic savior. She was a traitor. She was the woman who had, in an act of cowardice, given away their birthright. We have no record of her private conversations, but we can imagine the whispers, the cold stares in the hallways, the barely concealed contempt. She was an outcast among her own people. The revolutionaries in the South dismissed her as a feudal relic. The conservatives in the North despised her as a coward. She had no one. Her husband, who hated her, was dead. Her aunt, who controlled her, was dead. Her only rival, consort Zhen, was dead. She was surrounded by thousands of people, yet she was, perhaps for the first time, completely and utterly alone. She had only one role left: to be the guardian of the child emperor, to ensure the articles of favorable treatment were upheld. She was no longer a ruler. She was the chief administrator of a historical theme park. And what of the new master of China, President Yuan Shikai? He treated her with impeccable and chilling politeness. He would send her messages, inquire after her health, and assure her of the Republic's protection. He was, after all, her chief of staff, the manager of her abdication. On October 10, 1912, the first anniversary of the Wuchang Uprising, Yuan Shikai held a massive celebration in Beijing. It was the national day of the new republic, and he did something extraordinary. He sent a formal invitation to the Forbidden City. He invited the Empress Dowager Longyu and the Emperor Puyi to attend the celebrations of the revolution that had overthrown them. Longyu, in a final act of political theater, politely declined. But she sent a message of congratulations, and she ordered a magnificent feast to be held inside the Forbidden City to celebrate the founding of the Republic. It is one of the most surreal and tragic images in all of history. Inside the palace, the last emperor and the last Empress Dowager, surrounded by their costumed eunuchs, celebrating the death of their own empire. It was the ultimate necessary humiliation. This life, this existence as a living ghost, could not last. Longyu had survived the terror of the revolution, but she could not survive the peace. Her entire life she had been defined by a single purpose, even if it was a negative one. She was Sixi's tool. She was Guangxu's wife. She was the other woman against consort Zhen. Then for 3 brief, terrifying years, she was the regent. She had something to do, even if it was just to be afraid. Now she had nothing. History had no more use for her. She had performed her one final function. She had signed the paper. In the cold Beijing winter of 1912, her health, which had never been robust, began to fail rapidly. This was not a sickness that could be diagnosed. It was a sickness of the soul. It was the physical manifestation of melancholy, of obsolescence. She was 45 years old, but her life was over. The world she knew was gone, and she had been the one to sign its death certificate. The weight of that act, the blame, the loneliness, the sheer purposelessness of her existence, it was too much to bear. She began to fade. She stopped eating. She rarely left her dark, cold chambers in the palace. The stipend from the Republic was arriving, but the money couldn't buy a reason to live. On February 22, 1913, just 1 year and 10 days after she had signed the abdication edict, Empress Dowager Longyu died. She was 45 years old. Her death was quiet, lonely, and anticlimactic, just like her life. But her death now presented the new republic with an extraordinary and awkward problem. What do you do with the body of an empress in a republic? She was technically a private citizen, but she was also technically still the empress. How do you bury her? As a relic of a dead dynasty, or as a citizen of the new nation? And this is where Yuan Shikai, the master politician, performed his final act of cynical genius. He saw her death not as a problem, but as an opportunity. He did not give her a quiet, private funeral. Instead, he ordered a full, magnificent state funeral. He declared a period of national mourning. He ordered flags across the country, the new five-striped Republican flag, to be flown at half-mast. He sent a personal moving eulogy to be read at her casket, praising her for her profound wisdom and virtue. Why? Why would the president of a republic give an imperial funeral to the empress of the regime it just overthrew? Because Yuan Shikai understood theater. By honoring Longyu in death, he was showing the nation and the world his benevolence. He was showing the remaining Manchu princes that he was a man of his word, that he respected tradition. He was showing the revolutionaries that the transition was peaceful, civilized. He was, in effect, holding a funeral, not just for Longyu, but for the entire imperial system. He was respectfully, publicly, and officially bearing the past. It was a masterstroke of public relations. The funeral itself was one of the most bizarre spectacles Beijing had ever seen. On February 27, 1913, her casket was carried out of the Forbidden City. The procession was a collision of two worlds. There were the traditional Manchu honor guards, in their silk robes and peacock feathers, burning paper money. There were Buddhist monks and Taoist priests chanting ancient sutras, and marching right beside them, in perfect formation, were battalions of the new Republican Army in their Western-style, high-collared uniforms, carrying modern rifles. The new five-striped flag of the Republic flew beside the ancient, fearsome dragon banners of the Qing, the new president, Yuan Shikai, attended in person, wearing a black suit and a top hat, bowing deeply before her casket. It was the perfect, surreal visual metaphor for the world Longyu had left behind, a world where a newborn republic was paying for the funeral of the ancient empire it had just killed. She was taken to the western Qing tombs outside Beijing, and there, in a final poignant act of historical irony, she was laid to rest. Her tomb was placed directly beside the tomb of her husband, the Emperor Guangxu, the man who had despised her in life, the man who had loved another, the man whose reformist dreams she had helped to crush. In death, the unloved wife and the broken husband were finally and silently reunited. Longyu's personal story was over. She had lived as a shadow and she died as a symbol. But her legacy, the meaning of her quiet, tragic life, was just beginning. What does it mean when the weakest person in the room makes the most profound decision? What is the legacy of a woman whose only great act was to surrender? The story of Empress Dowager Longyu should have ended there. She was buried. The Republic moved on. Yuan Shikai, the man who organized her funeral, would soon try to betray that very Republic, attempting to make himself emperor, failing and dying in disgrace. China would subsequently shatter into the chaos of the warlord era, a period of unimaginable violence that would make the final dying days of the Qing look almost peaceful. Longyu's great pragmatic sacrifice, the peaceful abdication to avoid civil war, had only bought a moment's peace. In many ways, she is a more modern figure than any of them. She is the embodiment of 20th century anti-heroism. She is the small person, the bureaucratic functionary, the overlooked marginal individual who is suddenly, terrifyingly, given a choice that will affect millions. She is the opposite of the great man theory of history. She is the invisible woman of history, whose greatest act was an act of erasure. She made herself and her entire dynasty disappear.